Okay, welcome to this introduction to our class. In this presentation, we're going to briefly talk about three themes that we're going to cover in this class, and particularly in the first third of the semester. We're talking about theoretical ideas about inequality. Um, these three main themes are, first, the distinction between structure and agency. Agency is that which is within the individual's control, and structure is that which is beyond the individual's control. Second, we're talking about individualism versus collectivism. Individualism is made up of those theoretical ideas that emphasize the individual's role in society, versus collectivism. We're going to be focusing on the collective, that is the group, and the effect of society. And thirdly, we're going to talk about transitions from traditional societies to modern societies. Most of the theorists we're going to talk about do talk about transitions of where we've been as a culture and where we are moving towards, where we've come to, right? So this video is mainly, focusing on broad overview of the first third of our class and these themes that are going to be recurring throughout the whole semester, right? So we're only going to touch on these things on the surface level, and we're going to dive deeper into all these ideas as we talk about individual theorists. Okay, so first let's talk about agency and structure. So agency, like I said, refers to those factors that are within individual's control. So what can an individual control? Well, their own ability or their own level of intelligence, how motivated they are, what their attitudes are, how hardworking they are. Those things are within individual's control. But those aren't the only things that will lead to someone being successful or not successful in society. Um, on the other hand, you have things that are structural factors, things that are beyond the individual's control. So, for example, nobody picks what family they're born into or what schools they attend as a child. Nobody really has much effect on what neighborhoods they grow up in or the labor market characteristics, what city they happen to be living in. And also, people are affected by widely held stereotypes that people may have a hold of them. So women or racial minorities may be negatively affected by stereotypes that other people hold of them, and that's not really within their control, right? So, uh, but in our society, we tend to emphasize agency. Explanations for success or failure tend to emphasize agency over structure. And a example of this is the American dream. We're taught that this is what's called a meritocracy or a meritocratic society, that people who uh, are successful have worked hard for it and deserve it, versus people who, on the other hand, are not successful. We're taught the flip side of meritocracy is that people who are not successful aren't successful because they just didn't work hard enough or they weren't smart enough. It's their own fault, right? So this class is calling into question this, what I would call a myth of meritocracy, by focusing on structural factors beyond the individual's control that help shape how successful they are or unsuccessful they are in society. Now, like I said, um, I would argue that our society in general emphasizes agency over structure. Most of the explanations you've probably been exposed to outside of sociology classes emphasize individual hard work. Just work hard, keep your head down, and you will be rewarded, right? When I say keep your head down, I mean do what you're supposed to in class. Don't break the rules, don't break laws, and you will be rewarded, right? Now, I'm not saying that agency or hard work or individual ability doesn't matter. It does matter, but the point of this class is there are other things that are beyond an individual's control that also are very powerful predictors of success or failure in our society. And so these structural causes of inequality is what we're going to be focusing on, um, more than agency-based explanations for inequality. And really, this focus on structure is what distinguishes sociology from other social sciences, right? Um, you might have psychologists who focus more on the individual's mind. Um, Anthropology may focus more on culture. Obviously, political science is focusing on political dimensions of social factors. But what distinguishes sociology is this focus on social structure. Hopefully at the end of this class, you will be able to take on more of a structural explanation for racial or not racial differences, but differences in general in wealth, power, and inequality. Okay, so this second distinction we're going to look at is the distinction between a collectivist perspective and an individualist perspective. Now, the collectivists I'm going to talk about in detail are Karl Marx, Max Weber, Melvin Tooman. They tend to focus more on the collective, which we'll talk about in detail in a second. Then on the other hand, you have people who are focusing more on individualists or individualistic explanations for inequality. So Emile Durkheim, clearly Ayn Rand, and Davis and Moore all focus on individualism. And then there's Georg Simmel, who sort of more of a balanced view, sort of falls in between these two extremes. So here's a slide that looks at the spectrum from individualism to collectivism. And you should note that obviously individualists are going to emphasize more structural explanations for inequality, whereas collectivists are going to emphasize more structural explanations. So Karl Marx is a very well-known so-called founding father of sociology, and he developed what he called the conflict perspective. This idea here is that society is organized and shaped, and everyone's real perspective about society is shaped by the competing interest groups that dominate society, right? What he called the relations of production. He is very critical of the current relations of production that exists in capitalism. And we're going to talk about that in great detail. Then you have Max Weber, who builds on the ideas of Marx. Weber argued, was too what's called economically deterministic. That is, Weber believed that Marx emphasized economy, the economics, and really didn't focus on other factors that lead to inequality, such as status or prestige or political processes. He's credited as also being one of the so-called founding fathers of sociology, and he's credited with developing the interactionist perspective. For the purpose of our class, we're going to be looking at his ideas of rationalization in particular, and the role of bureaucracy in shaping levels of inequality in society. But he's also more of falls on the collectivist end of the spectrum. The third of three so-called founding fathers of sociology is Emile Durkheim. He is credited with developing the structural functionalist perspective, and he just really saw social factors in a qualitatively different way. Rather than seeing it as a result of competing interest groups in conflict with one another, Emile Durkheim saw society as imbalance, right? There was an equilibrium, and social change only happened when that equilibrium was upset, right? So it's a very different way of looking at things. And so he's more on the individualist perspective, and very much on the individualist perspective is another social thinker who was not really a sociologist. In fact, I would say that she's more of a critic of sociology, and that's Ayn Rand. She is a uncompromising defender of capitalism, right? She emphasizes the great contributions of what she called intellectual giants, the movers and shakers of society, and she thought that capitalism was the one economic system in which these great thinkers were most able to flourish and become successful and contribute to all of us, right? Now, also coming from individualist perspective is Davis and Moore. We're going to talk about their theory that justifies inequality, because essentially what they're saying, Davis and Moore says, is that inequality is necessary because we need to have people motivated to do important jobs in society, and the way you motivate workers is to reward them, right? And so we'll see that is a sort of a justification of inequality. Now, Melvin Tooman comes and critiques Davis and Moore's ideas. He's coming from more of a conflict perspective, or a Marxist perspective, and I think you'll find that conversation or debate very interesting. And in the middle, you have Georg Simmel. And he also came from the conflict perspective, but the conflict he focused on wasn't a conflict between competing interest groups like Marx was focused on, but rather the conflict was for Simmel, the defining conflict of society was the conflict between the individual and society, right? So you had the individual trying to carve out a unique life, right? Something distinctive about their own life, and there's a desire to do that on at the individual level, but this is in conflict with society that was pressuring people to conform to the needs of society. So this slide really gives you an overview of the kind of people we're going to be talking about. Now, the third theme we're going to look at is the transition from traditional to modern societies. This is a theme that many different theorists, in fact, most theorists we're going to talk about, touch on, but they come at it from vastly different perspectives and different angles. So there's some people like Marx, for example. He's focusing on the relations of what he calls the relations of production, or the struggle between the haves and have-nots. And in the past, there have been different types of relations of production that have defined societies. So in ancient societies, the dominant relations of production was between slaves and slave owners. That is, you'd have slave owners or pharaohs who claimed to be divine, to be gods themselves, and that legitimated their ownership of the slaves of the time. This was replaced by a feudalistic type of society where you had nobles who claimed the divine right of kings, the idea that they were chosen by God to be the leaders of society, and you had a serf class which was not owned by but was indebted to the noble class. And that was eventually transitioned into a capitalistic society where you had the relation of production which was between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat class, the workers of the world, and the bourgeoisie, those are the owners of the means of production, or the capitalist class. And that's the current struggle that we have in modern society. So that's what really Marx focuses on, is that transition across history. Max Weber looks at a different dimension of change from traditional modern societies. He's arguing that we have shifted from a traditional type of action based on customs and traditions, and that was the basis of authority in the past, and we have increasingly transitioned into what he calls a rational, purposeful action and authority. So in the traditional societies, people were in positions of authority based on their religion, positions in religious organizations, for example, church leaders and whatnot. Now people are in positions of power and influence based on their position within a bureaucracy, and that is more of a rational, purposeful type of authority. Ferdinand defines a distinction between what he called Gemeinschaft, which roughly translates into community, in which there was a natural bond between individuals, a natural type of solidarity. And this transitions into what he called Gesellschaft, which roughly translates to society. And he argues that has replaced the Gemeinschaft orientation with a new type of orientation, which is increasingly leads to individuals being disconnected and isolated and living anonymous lives. So fascinating sort of transition there. Emil Durkheim, who, if you remember, comes from a structural functionalist perspective, he emphasizes mechanical solidarity in traditional societies where people were held together by their similarities. That is, people typically did the same types of things. They were mostly, in most societies, they were farmers. They had a similar religion. They had similar customs to the people living around them. Over time, this transitions into what he called organic solidarity, where people are doing vastly different things. We don't have the same types of roles in society, but we still have a form of solidarity. In the past, people were held together by their similarities. Everybody came from the same customs and culture and religion. Now there's a diversity of those types of things, but we're held together still. We have a form of solidarity based on what he called functional interdependence. We rely on other people to play their role in society. So we can be different, but we're still have a form of solidarity, new and different form of solidarity. Georg Simmel had a fascinating look at how the transition into urban settings, urbanization, had impact on the psychology of city dwellers. So he argued that in the traditional societies, people lived in rural settings where there was a lack of privacy. Basically, people knew your business, and it was very difficult to break out of the preconceived notions that people had of you. But in urban settings, this changes where people are increasingly living anonymous lives. A lot of people don't know anything about their uh, fellow city dwellers. And so this has both positives and negatives. It's positive in the sense that people can creatively determine their own lives and manage the impressions they give off to other people. But at the same time, he argues, Simmel does argue that there's a imposition of roles on city dwellers, that roles that they play are forced upon them. And when that's the case, it's not liberating, but rather it's alienating. So we'll talk about that in detail. And lastly, there's Marshall Salines, who makes a fascinating comparison between hunting and gathering societies and modern capitalistic societies. What he's really getting at is the question of what leads someone to be affluent. And he argues that affluence is really a relative, not absolute concept, that affluence is how much someone has relative to how much they want. And he's arguing that the hunting and gathering societies were affluent because while they may not have had as much in absolute terms that we have now in modern capitalistic societies, they didn't want as much. So they had what they wanted, and so therefore they were affluent, as opposed to in modern capitalistic societies. We are taught to have infinite wants, and we can never satisfy those infinite wants, and as a result, we're less affluent. Interesting short article we're going to talk about very soon. So those are the three main themes we're going to talk about in this first third of the class, and they're going to bleed in throughout the whole semester, where you're going to see us coming back to these themes. So if you have any questions, post them on our website, Desire to Learn, and I will answer the questions you post there. Thank you very much for listening.